Pokémon is a series that epitomizes the phrase, "from humble beginnings." What started as one man's attempt to capture and share the simple pleasures of his youth with others, and manifesting as a twist on a relatively straightforward JRPG formula, has since grown more and more sophisticated, now sporting 18 Pokémon types, each with its own strengths, weaknesses, and resistances, hundreds of techniques and moves, held items, genders, breeding, EVs, IVs, abilities, natures, and of course over 800 and counting Pokémon that all of this applies to. But perhaps this is appropriate, since, current complexity aside, Pokémon in its first iteration and at its core is a very simple story. It's a story about growing up, about coming of age. And while stories like this are a dime a dozen in film, literature, and even video games are getting there, what sets Pokémon apart from other stories of this kind is how it uses its mechanics and its medium to tell an even more personal and resonant story than we might be used to. The coming-of-age story is a tremendously popular genre for both literature and film because it's something to which everyone can relate. The story of a young person on a journey of self-discovery and coming into his or her own through facing adversity. It's a truly universal genre. Adults recognize it as something they've already been through and might look back on nostalgically, while children and teenagers more closely identify with and relate to the anxieties and insecurities, but also the excitement of growing up. And Pokémon fits quite neatly into this genre. But before we get to the unique place Pokémon occupies as one of these stories, I think it's useful to first illustrate just how neatly it fits in by pointing out what it has in common with these stories. The first and most straightforward comparison being, of course, the journey, in which one or more protagonists embark upon a quest that takes them away from family and familiar society. This manifests in Pokémon in our protagonist leaving home at 11 years old with a very nebulous goal, and surprisingly enough, this is actually consistent as well. The protagonist in these stories often sets out with a goal or a desire, but not one that's especially intense or urgent, which typically results in him or her covering a great deal of territory in a meandering sort of way. And this is absolutely the case with Pokémon. We begin the game with a very general roadmap of conquering the Pokémon gyms, but along the way we'll backtrack several times, face roadblocks, and make stops in places off the beaten path like the SS Anne, the power plant, etc. Also worth mentioning here is the setting, which in the original Pokémon titles has a real-life analog in and even geographical similarities to the Kanto region of Japan. And this is pretty interesting, because while the other areas featured in the series also have geographical similarities to other areas of Japan and even to the world, this is the only one that has such a direct, stated analog. And this is important, because what it does is make the setting relatable. Admittedly, more so to Japanese players, but as coming-of-age stories typically take place in realistic, everyday settings like a suburb or a high school, it's a means to ground the story in an area that the intended audience would be familiar with. Many of the journeys in this genre are circular as well, and see the protagonist leave home, go on an adventure, and then return home having learned some sort of lesson. And while these lessons or realizations are far more important to the actual coming of age rather than simply the structure of the journey, it's still worth mentioning, not only because the lessons are certainly present in Pokémon, and more on this later, but because this first generation is the only generation in which you make this very deliberate return home, to see just how far you've come, to look on where you started this journey with older, more experienced eyes before continuing on to your final destination. This journey, however, is never easy, and along the way the optimism and excitement and potential that the characters begin with is gradually worn down by the uncomfortable realities of life. In Pokémon, this largely manifests as Team Rocket, the criminal organization that's involved in everything from small-time shakedowns, to Pokémon abuse, to legitimate acts of terrorism in Saffron City, and were more likely than not responsible for the years of horrific gene splicing and DNA engineering experiments resulting in Mewtwo. Not to mention the other forms of adversity that are all too common in these kinds of stories. There's the experience with death in Lavender Town, where we come face to face with the concept of mortality, and of course, your rival. And your rival is particularly important when it comes to adversity, because this first generation is one of the only times in the entire Pokémon series that your rival poses a genuine challenge that you have to overcome. And this is demonstrated not only mechanically by his ambushing you at less than convenient times, typically at the end of areas when you're already worn down, picking the starter that counters your own, and of course being what's effectively the final boss, but narratively as well. Narratively, your rival is always one step ahead of you, beating gyms before you and beating you to Pokédex milestones as well, and he's always sure to mention this in his own condescending way. Your rival is a jerk, and that's actually significant, because despite the series' shift towards more friendly rivals, which is fine because friends are good and everything, it's never again presented as a challenge in the way it is here. Your rival in this first generation therefore provides not only a very simple but also very personal motivator, but a central driving conflict to which everyone can relate. Once again, the relatability being tremendously important for these coming-of-age stories to have the sort of universal appeal that they do. Compare simply being a jerk to the considerably more grandiose motivations of the antagonists in later generations that young players especially probably have no real investment or even interest in, and you'll see what I mean. But what I've covered so far are genre conventions, the sorts of things that appear in virtually any story of this kind. Part of what makes Pokémon truly unique is how the game supports these ideas through mechanics like evolution, which Pokémon didn't pioneer but does use in a different way and for a different purpose. In Digimon, the series that did introduce the idea, evolution is similar to how the characters in Dragon Ball Z unlock new levels of Super Saiyan, which they can then access almost at will. It also serves a similar metaphorical purpose, representing the ability to overcome the limits we place on ourselves and realize our potential. In Pokémon, on the other hand, these transformations are permanent, which is significant because it serves as a visual and mechanical representation of growth. Over the course of your journey, you'll see these creatures that accompany you grow and mature, often from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. It's no accident, nor is it just a cheap ripoff of Digimon because of just how thoroughly this idea permeates the game. It's also the case with the trainers, who grow in a very similar way, from young hobbyists and enthusiasts, to serious teens and adolescents, to passionately devoted adults, all again serving as a visual and mechanical metaphor for growing up. What makes Pokémon really interesting though, and how it captures the essence of what a coming-of-age story really is how it deals with the most important element of the genre, the protagonist and his or her growth and development. After all, you can't have a coming-of-age story without someone to come of age. And in Pokémon, this manifests quite strangely. Coming-of-age stories typically emphasize dialogue or monologue. You have long discussions or observations about things. And in coming-of-age video games, this is often the case as well. Pokémon, on the other hand, features a silent protagonist, and so it's difficult to say at which point in the game he makes the transition from naive to wise, idealist to realist, immature to mature, or whether any psychological or moral growth is really taking place at all, even though it ostensibly does, according to Oak. And so while on the surface this character may go through something resembling an arc, I think it's far more interesting and enlightening to consider an idea I've brought up before, the relationship between player and avatar. Because I don't think it's a stretch at all to say that as this player character seems to grow, the player him or herself almost certainly does. And what makes Pokémon really special is that the key moments of actual development typically found in a coming-of-age story arc are reserved for the player alone. What I mean is that Pokémon is by no means a difficult game, but it does ask the player to consider a number of things about how they play the game and what they value with regards to the mechanics. There's so much for the player to think about here. Consider not only the starter Pokémon and the archetypes that very generally appeal to the chooser, the intense passionate fire type, the cool relaxed water type, or the calm collected grass, but how the player builds their team moving forward. Whether they take the time to build and raise a balanced team that accounts for type differences and counters accordingly, favor one type over others, or rely on a couple or even a single Pokémon. Whether they play to win and go for the biggest, baddest legendary Pokémon out there, or instead use the ones they like the best, regardless of how effective they are in battle. Then there's the moves they choose. Do they strategically cripple the opponent with poison, sleep, or paralysis? Or do they power through opponents with brute force? The stat boosting moves are similarly worth considering. A well-placed +2 after all can completely change the course of a battle. Consider as well what constitutes a balanced move pool and how many slots you're willing to devote to type coverage. The point here is that there's as many ways to play the game as there are players, and each way is as valid as the next. And ultimately, in the process of making all of these decisions, the player carves out an identity for him or herself within the game. A team and a style of play that's distinctly theirs. And that's really interesting, because in these coming-of-age stories, there comes a moment where the protagonist shows his or her growth and development. A moment of individuation, where the character establishes him or herself as separate and distinct from others and finally becomes a real presence in the narrative. It's exactly what happens in Pokémon. Only here the game uses its mechanics and our ability to choose and make decisions, the things that make it a game, to inspire in the player his or her own individuation. One that's defined not by an author or director with characters and scenarios to which we may or may not relate, but by the player, him or herself. And that's powerful stuff. Which is why the identity you formed through your play is one that you probably carry with you, at least in part to this day. Whether it's choosing a certain version of a new Pokémon title, or building a truly competitive team around one or two of your favorites. But the thing about individuation is that, by definition, it can't occur in a vacuum. It's only by associating with other individuals who have differing morals, beliefs, and values that our own morals, beliefs, values, and ultimately our identity is truly defined. And the problem with video games, at least in 1998, is that they were largely single-player experiences. And so a game seeking to inspire individuation, even one with accompanying visuals and mechanics, would still fail to realize that in the player, because such an event could only take place in the game's world. But Pokémon manages to account for this as well by the virtue of its two versions. Not only was the version you got one of the first determining factors of your in-game identity as a red or blue version player, but the fact that there are two versions of the game with different Pokémon on each means that you're encouraged to engage with other players, to express that identity that you create beyond just the game's world, to share your experience, to collaborate with or compete against other players who have not only different morals, beliefs, and values, but different preferences, different styles, and different strategies, in order to accomplish whatever it is that you value, whether it's catching them all, becoming the best battler on your block, or even just making friends through the game. And this goal of yours is also important because it too, like I said, is ultimately defined by the player. I mentioned earlier that the protagonist of a coming-of-age story usually leaves home with a goal that's vague at best, and that this is no different in Pokémon. In fact, Oak says at the beginning of the game that your journey is about to start, but doesn't tell you that your goal is to become a Pokémon Master, whatever that means, or even to complete the Pokédex. It's up to the player to decide what meaning to take from this experience. Ultimately, when you break it down like this, Pokémon is a fairly straightforward coming-of-age story. It hits all the beats that you'd expect from any ordinary entry into the genre, but at the same time it's a remarkable achievement that uses our ability to express ourselves through play as a means to tell this story. And in doing so, it accomplishes something truly unique, an evolution, if you will, of the coming-of-age story that uses the video game as a medium to its advantage, and in doing so, imparts its message directly to the player. These seemingly innocuous design choices all have a purpose and a result. And the result is that, like most coming-of-age stories, Pokémon is a journey, one of self-discovery and identity, of perseverance in the face of adversity. But it's one that's as much for the player as it is for the player character. And maybe for that reason, it's a journey that many of us will never forget.